Good morning, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day to anybody who is Irish or even people who aren't Irish and people who pretend to be. I just want to say thank you for joining us for this webinar. We're happy to have you here. My name's John Phelan. I'm an economist at the Centre of the American Experiment. And the main body of the webinar today is going to be my colleague, Isaac Orr. I will let him introduce himself. So Isaac, over to you.
Hey, John, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. I am also Irish American, but we're from Northern Ireland, so we wear orange on St. Patrick's Day and look down on all the debauchery that's happening right now because we're good Protestants over in north of Ireland. But John and I were just having a conversation about this because obviously his family is from there too. But welcome, thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about how liberal energy policies make energy more expensive today, and what better way than to start off the presentation with a picture of our fearless leader, Governor Tim Walz, with his best friend, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So about Center of the American Experiment, you guys probably know a lot about us if you're here for this webinar, but if you have not signed up for Thinking Minnesota or signed up your friends and family for Thinking Minnesota, make sure you do that. It's a free magazine. And then also about me, you probably already know who I am, but I'm the policy fellow who specializes in energy and environmental policy. My writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And the reason I care about issues like energy is because I grew up on a dairy farm in rural Wisconsin, and just kind of being involved with the production of food and having to deal with things like high costs of gasoline, fertilizer, things like that. I just really care about issues that are important to rural Wisconsinites. And then here's John. His bio, pretty short and sweet. You wanna elaborate a little bit, John?
Well, my parents are Irish, so there's my elaboration. I think what we will do is introduce ourselves. We're going to hand over to Isaac for the kind of bulk of the presentation, and we'll try and leave about 10, maybe 15 minutes for questions at the end. So once again, Isaac, over to you.
Yeah, well, John studied at the London School of Economics, so he's good at this stuff. So Energy 101, let's just talk this. I think that this is one of the most important things that we can do to educate ourselves and our family members and our friends about why energy is so important to everything that's happening with inflation right now. Because energy in the dictionary is by definition is the ability to do work, and without energy, no work gets done. So that makes energy the invisible ingredient in everything. It's the heat that turns the goopy mess of pumpkin pie into something that other people enjoy eating. I personally don't care for it. I think it's kind of gross. I'm a pecan pie man myself, but it's the stuff that transforms iron ore into the steel that we use in our buildings. And it's the stuff that helps us, cut the hay, rake the hay, bale the hay, and transport the hay that we feed to the cows that we eat for our own source of energy. So why is energy important? Increasing people's access to energy allows them to do more work. Doing more work increases human productivity, and higher productivity allows each person to make more stuff. Increasing the amount of stuff that we each provide increases our material, well-being, increases our standard of living. And if we make energy less available or more expensive, we are going back down the wrong way when it comes to making ourselves more productive and more prosperous. I know John Phelan has a really good paper on capital formation, and it's interesting. There's kind of, John talks about the economy in terms of money, and I kind of think about it in terms of transfers of energy. And maybe John and I will sit down and write a paper about that someday. But our low energy history, our low energy Jeb history, human standards of living were much lower when our muscles supplied the bulk of the energy needed to do work. And energy is kind of a superpower. It's the great amplifier. So a human can work at a rate of about 0.13 horsepower, meaning that one horse can provide as much as 7.5 times more energy than one person, right? So that means that my grandpa Phil could get 15 times more work done with his team of horses than he could ever hope to get done by himself. And when we talk about energy now, we have this big diesel Caterpillar. This is a D11. It has 850 horsepower, which means it does the job of 6,350 and 75 people all pulling in unison, which is more than my hometown of Waupaca, Wisconsin. So when we think about the importance of having secure supplies of reliable, affordable energy and how important that is to our economy, I really can't understate that. So in order to kind of appreciate that, we need to know where our energy comes from, because unreliable energy is like kryptonite to our economy. So where does it come from? I like to think of this as, imagine the battery in your phone, right? So all of the energy that we use constitutes a sliver of that battery, right? So if your battery could be charged to any percentage, what percentage would you want it to be charged to, John?
Me, 99.
99, man, what an outlier. He's not greedy. He's not one of those 1%ers.
But you want to always leave yourself room for improvement.
Sure. Yeah, you're a 9 out of 10, John. Don't never forget that. So how much solar energy do we get from each energy source? When I ask people this, people say, oh, probably not a lot from solar or wind, maybe 10, 20%. When you look at Minnesota, it's 1% for solar, 5% for wind. In contrast, 35% of our energy comes from oil, 30% comes from natural gas, 11% from coal, 8% from nuclear, and 10% from biomass, and that's mostly ethanol. So wind and solar, the two sources of energy that we pretty much hear the most about in terms of this is the future of energy, 6% of our total energy consumption, even though we've been subsidizing and mandating it for the last 15 years. And, it's basically the same story on a national level. 10% of our energy comes from coal, 34% from gas, 35% from oil, 9% from nuclear, 3% from hydro, 1% from solar, 3% from wind, 5% from biomass, which means we still get more of our total energy from burning wood than we do from wind and solar combined. That bastion of modern technology, burning wood. So now that we know what energy is and why it's important, where it comes from, we can talk about how liberal energy policies are making the cost of energy go up and making it less reliable. Basically, President Biden ran on the promise that he was going to get rid of fossil fuels. So he wants to get rid of 76 to 79% of the energy that we rely on in the United States and Minnesota and switch over to sources of energy that really cannot match that supply. So let's just talk about oil. Oil has been in the news a lot more. I gave this presentation in St. Cloud, or a version of this presentation in St. Cloud, a month ago today, and it feels like 4 years of events have happened in the last 4 weeks. So I had to really kind of add to this slide because in the last 4 weeks, we've seen this huge increase in the cost of oil. And a lot of that is due to the Russian invasion. But as John and I are going to talk about, there were a lot of events that led up to that invasion that were driven by bad energy policy. So also the COVID-19 lockdown played a big role. At one point in May of last year, the price of oil went negative. So for those of you who've never tried to sell anything, it's not good to pay people to take your product. In those circumstances, the people who produce things stop producing them as fast as they can, and they become hesitant to re-enter the market. And, in Minnesota, this to me became very obvious when we had those stories coming out of Western Minnesota of farmers having to gas their hogs because there wasn't a place to process them, right? So, growing up on a farm in Wisconsin, if we were in that circumstance, we were a small time farm anyway, so we didn't make much money on the hogs anyway. You can't make money as a small independent farmer in the hog business anymore, just not the way that the industry works. But if we were in a situation where we worked our butts off, we fed these pigs, we cleaned the pens every day, and as soon as we were about ready to get them into the market, we had to gas them instead and find a place to get rid of them, I guarantee you we would not be chomping at the bit to start growing more hogs. So same thing with the oil industry. These oil producers lost a lot of money on these wells because they not only incurred the expenses of drilling them, but they also had to pay people to get rid of the product. So, and it really doesn't help that as soon as the Biden administration was inaugurated on day one, they started doing things like canceling the Keystone Pipeline, getting rid of local decision authority for permitting at the BLM level. Everything became politicized and everything was geared toward erecting barriers to impede domestic oil production. So talked about a few of these things, but then not only did President Biden say, no, we don't want to facilitate the infrastructure needed to develop oil in the United States. We're going to ask OPEC plus to pump more oil. And for those of you who don't know, the plus in OPEC plus is Russia. So instead of, and then Biden goes and asks OPEC to pump more oil to bring prices down. They basically said, do it yourself. He wasn't willing to do that. So, if oil prices continue to rise, it's going to cause a recession, in my opinion. Maybe John can elaborate on that a little bit later. But, we need to talk about this idea that, presenting a hostile front to an industry is going to produce less of whatever that industry produces. We're seeing this in St. Paul right now because of the rent control moratorium, the rent control ordinance. John, you want to talk about that for a second? Because did the rent control ordinance prohibit building new buildings in St. Paul?
Absolutely, because what it does, when you invest in the expectation of a return. People don't generally invest out of the goodness of their hearts. They do so, like I say, because they're looking for a return. And with something like this, with this rent control thing, is you cap the potential return. And if it's above what you can get as a return doing something else, or if it's below, kind of inflation or something like that, which is a problem now, then you're just not going to do it. And it's the same thing, I think, with the energy industry. What you're doing is you're kind of flattening or putting an upper bound on the returns that there are to investment. So you just won't invest. It's very simple stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And things like Senator Elizabeth Warren at Sheldon Whitehouse are now talking about taxing the profits of oil companies in order to give it back to people. That's a really great way to get them to not want to produce more oil.
That's one of the stupidest ideas I've ever heard.
Would you like to elaborate? Yeah.
You can't elaborate. It's just stupid.
Yeah, it is. It's really bad. All right. So let's talk about, is it Putin's price hike? I would argue no. The anti-drilling policies in the United States and, importantly, European countries who have banned fracking for natural gas and oil, I would argue that they enabled Putin's aggression by making Western Europe countries totally beholden to the Kremlin for their energy, right? And totally is probably an overstatement. They import a lot of oil and gas from Norway as well, but they need that gas, especially Germany, who was for some reason, Minnesota politicians think that Germany is some bastion of smart green energy policy, when really you could not pick a country that's done a worse job over the last 2 decades of doing the right thing, right? So Germany has shut down their nuclear power plants, which were the largest sources of energy that didn't emit CO2. They've shut down a lot of their coal plants. They've built a whole bunch of wind turbines and solar panels that, oh, surprise, surprise, don't work very frequently. And now they burn Russian natural gas to keep the lights on because, if the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, they need energy from somewhere. So the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, said a boycott of Russian gas and oil could cause mass poverty in Germany. So the boycotting Russian natural gas in Germany would cause more damage to Germany than it would to Russia, right? So that's wild. Biden's obstacles to American energy development are putting more oil in Putin's pocket every single day. So John and I wrote a piece last week talking about how American oil imports were increasing we're basically paying $74 million a day to Russia for gasoline, crude oil, and diesel imports. But that's really less important, in my opinion, than the fact that we are not contributing as Americans to the global oil supply as much as we possibly could, right? So, going to go back to the farm here, but so if we had a good crop in the United States, but Brazil has a bad crop of soybeans, the price of soybeans around the world goes up, regardless of whether you were going to buy those soybeans from my dad or a Brazilian farmer, right? So the reduction in global supply increases the cost or increases the price. So the fact that we are impeding our own energy development right now is really increasing the cost that Vladimir Putin can get for a barrel of oil. And that, to me, is the bigger travesty. And people don't really think about that aspect of this. So in 2021, exports of crude petroleum products and natural gas accounted for $243 billion of Russia's economy. John Phelan put that together. We're working on a report on this right now. And Biden's foreign policy failures do not absolve him of the consequences of his foreign policy failures. You know, people talk about like, oh, well, the price of gas has gone up a lot since Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, maybe if Joe Biden doesn't have a horrible pullout from Afghanistan that just exuded weakness, and if he didn't have these really incoherent energy policies, Putin may not have felt now was the right time to do it. So let's talk about.
If I could just elaborate on some of the Putin stuff, if you just go back, it's worth noting, I think, that it's kind of a documented fact that the Russian government did bankroll the anti-fracking campaign in Britain and in the West. And so when Lenin famously talked about his supporters and the supporters of the Bolsheviks in Western Europe and called them useful idiots, the environmental movement in the West, particularly in places like Germany and in Britain, have been absolutely indispensable idiots to Vladimir Putin, and have played the key role in empowering him to do exactly the kind of thing that he's doing now. And if the Germans think that the situation facing them is pretty bad, and it would be if they cut off Russian gas, well, just imagine what the situation in Kiev or Mariupol's like. It's absolutely awful that we've empowered the guy to do this, and we've done it through this slavish adherence to green energy policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ukraine is paying the price for Western Europe's energy ignorance. And that is, it's always the countries that have less than the affluent countries that end up paying the bill for this kind of stuff. So, you know, frankly, I wish we had a better executive in the Oval Office who was saying, you need to pay 2% of your GDP towards defense, and you need to legalize fracking right now. Otherwise, you know, we'll be less inclined to send you cargoes of liquefied natural gas. But that's not where we're at. So here's a timeline of the gas price from Gas Buddy over the last, couple of years. So, I don't think it's fair to blame Biden for all of the increase in oil prices. I wrote a blog post about that. They got a lot of hate mail right after the president was elected. But when we look at the shutdowns from COVID, that sent a very strong message to the industry to stop producing. So it would have taken them a while, I think, for some of his bad policies like canceling Keystone or canceling the leases to fully materialize. But I think that, when we consider the fact that, he's chilling investment in this industry and basically telling them he wants to put them out of business, it's no surprise that they're not rushing to increase the supply. And we've got a little dose of that here in Minnesota. Governor Walz delayed Line 3 multiple times for no scientific reason. In fact, the reasoning for the Walz administration saying that we aren't going to approve this pipeline now was because they didn't think we would need the oil. The Commerce Department actually argued we're not going to need the oil. So it's pretty wild. And not only was Governor Walz, unscientifically opposing the Line 3 replacement project, he wants to impose a California fuel standard in Minnesota that has already increased the cost of electricity, natural or gasoline in California by 22 cents a gallon. And there are estimates that it'll increase the cost of gas in Minnesota by 20 to 54 cents per gallon, which is an extra, $570 per household at the high end there. And the worst, we have a paper coming out about this, so we'll maybe have our own webinar, but all of these green energy ideas or ideas geared to reduce emissions, put that as the top priority for energy policy, rather than having reliability, a secure supply, reliable energy, and affordable energy first. It's the exact wrong priorities. If you want to have some sort of sustainable environmental improvement, it needs to make sense from a physics perspective and an affordability perspective. But we're going to hop into natural gas here. So one of the reasons natural gas is so expensive is because of opposition to new pipelines. We have more natural gas than Carter has liver pills, to quote my grandpa. I don't even know what that phrase means, but it sounds good. So the Biden administration's nominees to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission have said that you need to take into account climate change when you're building new natural gas infrastructure. So this is actually impeding America's ability to sell natural gas, liquefied natural gas to China, which would displace coal. So Like none of this makes any sense from a, energy security, reliability, affordability, or environmental standard. It's all for show. It's all pageantry. And how that ends up hurting Minnesotans is natural gas prices are 2.3 times higher as of January 2022 than January 2020. Maybe that was January 2021. I don't know if I would have necessarily. 2020 was a weird year because of COVID, but I guess that was technically pre-COVID. But natural gas is the primary heating fuel in Minnesota. 66% of our homes use it to stay warm. It's also increasingly being used for electricity generation, and it's a key feedstock in things like plastics and fertilizers. And this is going to have a huge impact on everybody. Here's the cost of natural gas in the United States. It was high in 2014. That's really when the fracking booms for natural gas started around 2008. By 2014, we had become the world's largest producer. We're also the world's largest producer of oil. But these prices are creeping back up to levels that they haven't been since January of 14. And that means real hardships for real people. I think this is from the Pioneer Press. Minnesotans could see record heating bills this year. I opened it up and I think I literally gasped. So, people are paying huge costs for just to stay warm. And that's actually leading people to, turn down their heat or choose between heating and eating. And this is the exact opposite of what we should be aspiring to do as a country. We should be working our keisters off to make energy as affordable as possible so people have money to spend on other things. And this was also due to the COVID impact on natural gas prices. So we don't need to belabor that. But I do think it's interesting to talk.
Just to jump in a second there. I wrote a blog on the website yesterday, and we discussed this, I think, back in the last week. The inflation figures that we've had over the last year or so, we've seen obviously the highest US inflation since 1982, so 40-year inflation highs. But we've actually seen a higher rate of inflation in the Midwest and in the Twin Cities than we've seen nationally. And when you break that down, you find that a very large component of that is natural gas. Not only has natural gas gone up in price nationally, it's gone up in price significantly more than that here by something like 14 or 18 percentage points, depending on which geography you look at. So that's absolutely huge in terms of, why people are getting hit hard here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were looking at my bills, right, from this year and last year, because your better half takes care of the billing for you, so you didn't have access to that. But the other thing that's happening right now is we ran up a huge bill during polar vortex of 2021. The average increase in cost was $450 for 1 week of heating alone. And unfortunately, I'll talk about this a little bit later. The decisions that the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission is making in terms of shutting down our coal plants are going to make huge increases in natural gas prices even more painful in the future. And unfortunately, the current leadership is not going to change that. But I just want to draw the comparison between the United States, which is the largest producer of natural gas in the world, Europe, which decided that they were not going to produce their own gas, and Asia, which is just growing so quickly that it needs all the energy it can get its hands on. The cost of natural gas in the United States is a fraction of what it is in Europe. Part of that's because, the Russians are delivering the minimum amount of natural gas that they need in order to meet long-term supply contracts, but they're not really providing much more than that. So Europe is caught buying all of this natural gas on the spot market, and they're basically just trying to get as much American liquefied natural gas as possible. And this is increasing fertilizer prices. So natural gas is one of the primary feedstocks for nitrogen-based fertilizers. And my dad farms 300 acres. Last year, he paid $15,000 for fertilizer. I'm missing a zero in my slide. I'll fix that later. But this year he paid $34,000. So this is going to affect the price of food. So I don't think that this inflation is going to be transitory, regardless of what monetary policy happens. There's a lot of problems in the commodities markets that are imbalances that are going to need to sort themselves out through higher prices. There's a saying in commodities markets that the cure for high prices is high prices, because that's going to incentivize people to get back into the market and continue producing. All right, so electricity. This one's fun because we've been talking about this for a long time, right? Liberal energy policies are driving up the cost of electricity in Minnesota. This is the cost of electricity in Minnesota versus the national average since 2007, when we signed the Next Generation Energy Act into office. And the reason that prices are going up is because we're building a lot of wind and solar, and those are more expensive than operating our current coal plants, which are the Sherco and King plant. Natural gas, maybe not. This is an older figure with lower natural gas prices. That's probably gone up pretty substantially. And our Prairie Island nuclear plant is also one of the lowest cost sources. So, people talk about, oh, well, wind and solar are the lowest cost sources of energy because the wind is free and the sun is free, but the turbine isn't free, the solar panel isn't free, and then you have all kinds of hidden costs that go into that, like increasing property taxes, more transmission lines, because we're building these wind and solar, or the wind developments, especially in North Dakota, and we have to build transmission lines to send that electricity back to the Twin Cities. You also have utility profits. So Xcel Energy, Minnesota Power, whatever you want for investor-owned utilities in the state of Minnesota, they're not allowed to make a profit on the electricity they sell because they're government-approved monopolies, and it wouldn't be fair to just let them charge whatever they want. So their compensation is actually tied to the cost of providing the electricity to consumers, plus a 10% profit every time they build something new. So there is a perverse incentive for the utility company to shut down old depreciated assets, because you only get to make this 10% profit on the undepreciated part of your coal plant. So it's like a mortgage on a house, right? So as you pay off your mortgage, the amount of money that you're paying in interest goes down. And once that house is paid off, it is the most affordable place to live. If a utility company pays off their mortgage, they hate that asset because they're not making a profit on it, which is why companies like Xcel advertise on TV, oh, we're going green and it's going to be great for the planet. Well, it'll be great for their pocketbook, which is why they do it. And then you also have the additional cost of keeping a natural gas plant online to produce electricity when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. So, we're already seeing Xcel seeking 20% increases in the electricity rates over 3 years. And this is only going to get worse as they continue their green dreams, or whatever it's called. And we really need to have a rethink of the way that we pursue electricity policy in our state, because nuclear plants are the most efficient plants that we have, but it's currently illegal to build new ones. And there's currently a bill in the legislature, I'm going to testify on it next week, to lift this ban. And I guarantee you it's going to have unanimous support among conservatives, and it's going to have unanimous opposition among the liberals on the committee. That's just the way the world works. They think that we can power the world on solar and wind, but in 2019, solar only produced electricity 17% of the time, and wind was 33% of the time, if you're generous and round up. And it's important to note that, okay, so natural gas was only 53, coal was 48, but you could turn that up. Like, all you have to do to get the natural gas plant or the coal plant up to 80% is burn more natural gas or coal. We control those assets. Wind and solar, we have no idea when or if they're going to be generating electricity, because solar panels, if it snows, you don't get much power from them. And Ralph Jacobson, the owner of IPS Solar, actually told a reporter one time that it's too expensive to clear snow off of the solar panels. So, John, you're an economist. Tell me, if your business doesn't work in Minnesota, if it snows, is that a viable business?
Not really, no.
Okay, thank you.
It snows an awful lot, so yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, your master's degree from LSE really helps
Paying off there, yeah.
Clarify that. So this slide shows the generation of wind power during last year's February, and especially during the polar vortex. So at one point, it was producing 90% of its potential output. But then during the midst of the winter weather event, it was down at 4.9% and 3.8% for a few hours. So this kind of up and down generation is really hard to plan around, because every single time that the wind dies down, you need to have an increase in natural gas generation in order to kind of balance that load. So when we're thinking back to higher natural gas prices, especially for that week of February, or like last February, right? When we have that $450 increase in our home heating bills because the cost of natural gas was so high, this natural gas line would have to be even higher if we shut down the coal plants. But that's what a lot of liberal energy policy wonks want us to do. So we really need to have a better conversation about that. Hopefully, the current energy crisis in Europe and just the reframing of our energy conversations on security is going to help us do that. So I know I kind of rushed through my slides, but now we have time for questions and answers. So John, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, just a couple of points. One is that when you talk about the investment point and the effect of chilling investment, there's a phrase in economics of regime certainty or uncertainty. And it's like, how do you plan for something if you don't know what the tax rate's going to be, for example?
Sure.
So if you're a business and you want to invest, a tax hike or something like that down the line will impact the returns on that investment, that we referred to earlier. So it makes it very hard. You want something predictable. And if you don't know what policy is going to do, then you think, well, okay, because that, the uncertainty increases the cost. Another point about, expensive energy, you referred to that this would slow economic growth. That's absolutely right. If you go back to the 1970s, you see the oil price shocks, the OPEC shocks, 1973, 1979. And what they did was make energy a lot more expensive. So what that does, if you think about it in terms of your very basic supply and demand chart, is it shifts the supply curve way over and makes it much more expensive to produce output. And so there's much less output at any given price, which pushes the price up. So it slows growth and it's inflationary as well. And just another point that I'd make, and this kind of is a broader point, so maybe I'd ask you to elaborate on it, is that it seems, I saw somebody the other day talking about how to living a no carbon life. And I thought to myself, for most of human history, we kind of did that. That the no carbon life is what the people in Chaucer's time lived. It's what, the people in the Roman Empire lived, or something like that. Their carbon emissions are very, very small, but they lived at a very low standard of living. So it seems to me that the low carbon life is something that you have to be either very poor to live or very rich to live. If you're the sort of person who can just walk out and spend $60,000 on a Tesla because gas prices went up. By the way, you're also the same person who can't pay their student loans back.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me that if you're somebody in the middle, if you're the middle class, the no carbon life screws you basically, and it's it pushes you down. The only people who can really afford to live the no carbon life are the rich. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So. Just ask people in the developing world who are using, wood and dung. There's billions of people that do this for their home heating and cooking, whether they enjoy their, carbon neutral lifestyle. They obviously don't. So this is why, to me, you have to offer people a better mousetrap if you want to improve the environment. One of the things that I talk about is Norman Borlaug, the graduate of the University of Minnesota, who basically spent much of his life improving the varieties of wheat that we have available. He was down in Mexico crossbreeding all different kinds of wheat. And by making his wheat more productive, increasing the yield per acre, he was able to save 1 billion people from starvation while also reducing the amount of land it would require to feed those people, right? So if we want to have some sort of low carbon lifestyle without forcing people to basically do less with less, which is what that, wind, solar, the idea that we can use battery storage, that's what that is. It's like this idea that you just need to become more efficient with your energy use. Sure, that works if you're just going to turn the lights off when you leave, but that's not okay if they're just saying, well, you shouldn't have lights in the first place. So one of the reasons I think nuclear power is so great is, the amount of energy that it takes to produce 1 MWh of electricity, that takes a ton of coal. It takes a AAA battery's worth of uranium, right? So I think that nuclear power can satisfy that. Do you have a secure supply? Do you have a reliable generating source? We already saw that it's the most reliable out of all the different power plants. Is it affordable? Absolutely. We saw Prairie Island, much lower than new wind or solar. And is it, better for the environment? That's the whole suite. I was going to put together, I have this idea about, we have the Maslow's, or is it Maslow's hierarchy of needs? I just want to make sure that I'm not. So basically you have your base needs, right? You need food, water, shelter. And then you have at the top of the pyramid, it's self-actualization, all of these kind of emotional needs that we have as humans. And I think that we need to have a real conversation about our energy hierarchy of needs. And the base of the pyramid needs to be a reliable supply, right? Or sorry, a secure supply, right? So, Germany is relying on natural gas, which is a reliable fuel to generate electricity when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. But they don't have a secure supply. They're basically hoping that Putin doesn't turn off the taps, right? That's why Germany was only going to send over 5,000 helmets to Ukraine, which is a total disgrace. But then you need a reliable fuel, right? So that's nuclear, natural gas, hydro, coal, all great options. Then you need it to be affordable, which is the next rung on the pyramid. And then at the very tip top, you can have carbon free. But you need to satisfy all of those other requirements first, and then you can start to think about the impact on the environment. But unfortunately, the way that our energy policy discussions are framed now, it's not about energy policy. People who, it's a lot of times people on the left think about it as a climate problem first and then an energy policy second. So they basically invert that pyramid, right? Which is why it's tipping over right now in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting point when you were just talking about the productivity aspect as well. We often hear things like, "Oh, solar produces so many jobs," wind produces so many jobs. But the point is not to produce jobs. You could, if you want to increase jobs in the wind industry, pay people to stand in fields and blow at the turbines.
Yeah.
Now you probably create an awful lot of jobs that way, but you're not going to create an awful lot of energy that way. And people often forget, I think, that the point of an energy industry is to generate energy. It's not to generate jobs. It's
Right.
to generate energy. And actually what you're looking for in terms of productivity, and you alluded to this, productivity from an economic growth and well-being perspective is like the absolutely crucial thing. From a productivity perspective, what you want is to produce a unit of energy with less labor, becoming more capital intensive rather than labor intensive. Because again, you go back to the pre-industrial life, the low carbon life. It's a very labor intensive life. It's a fairly miserable life, actually.
It's nasty, brutish, and short. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, an awful lot of the people who kind of idolize these things because they spent a weekend on a farm somewhere. I always remember in one of Marx's writings, he talked about what life would be like under communism. And he said, I would be free to milk my cows in the morning, to look after my fields of crops in the afternoon, and to critique Hegel in the evening or something like that. Well, there's a guy who never really did an honest day's work in his life.
Right.
Certainly was never in sniffing distance of a farm. If he thinks that you can look after cows just with a couple of hours in the morning before you go off and critique Hegel.
You gotta milk them twice a day, buddy. Like that's how it works. But yeah, absolutely. I get on this soapbox all the time because people think milk comes from the store, and they also just think that electricity comes from the outlet. But hopefully, I always thought, well, maybe the price increase of electricity is going to be enough to get people to reevaluate some of their preconceived notions on this. And then I thought, well, maybe these, blackouts will be enough to get people to reevaluate their just kind of uncritical belief that wind and solar and batteries can get us to where we need to be. So far, I don't think that's happened. They just think that we need to keep doubling down on it. And even Even Ukraine, Germany says we're going to increase our use of wind and solar in order to displace Russian natural gas. But that doesn't work, because if the wind isn't blowing in Germany in one area, then the odds are that it's going to be, blowing enough down the road are pretty low. And the sun sets on Germany pretty uniformly. So there's a question in the chat asking about, are there any promising developments in batteries for storing renewable energy production, and would better battery storage actually make wind and solar viable? So I don't think so. I was doing some reading on this, and Wood Mackenzie, the analytics firm, says that there's going to be about 700,000 megawatt hours of battery storage available in the world by 2030. It's about 1% of Minnesota's annual energy consumption, right? And if we go back to this slide that I was showing about the wind generation in the Midwest region, like, this isn't just Minnesota's wind. This is a 14-state region that includes North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, goes down into the Gulf of Mexico, down to Louisiana. So this argument that the wind is always blowing somewhere isn't correct. And you would need, what is this? This is like 10 days. You would need a lot of storage in order to facilitate a grid that is almost exclusively dependent on wind and solar. So, and right now it's just cost prohibitive to do that with storage, and you can't even get the physical batteries. The world's largest battery storage facility is at Moss Landing in California, and they haven't been able to turn it back on because it keeps overheating, right? So that's not to say that that is a necessary component of all future storage. I think they'll figure out a lot of that stuff, but the idea that we can just wave a magic wand and mandate this stuff into existence, irrespective of the realistic timeline for developing these kinds of technologies, is really dangerous. And California is going to learn that lesson in a really hard way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think, that Germany is going to switch apparently to renewables to help the Ukraine out. We have no idea how long that's going to take, and if the Ukrainians have that long, actually. It seems to me that if you're really serious about getting to kind of net zero in terms of carbon, nuclear is the only way you get there quickly, or in a reasonable time frame. And if you're not, if you're looking to get rid of carbon and you're also writing nuclear off as an alternative, then you're not really serious, are you? Your agenda is really something different. What do you think about that?
That's spot on, right? It's absurd to think that wind and solar are going to be able to handle this load for a whole bunch of different reasons, right? So from an energy security standpoint, 80% of solar panels come from China. They are manufactured in Western China, where slave labor is used. Enslaved Muslim Uyghurs are forced to build solar panels in factories in Western China, in factories powered by coal. Tell me how that makes sense from like an energy security standpoint. The rare earth metals that are used in wind turbine magnets overwhelmingly come from China. So, putting aside some of the obvious physical limitations of trying to run a grid with wind and solar, how can anyone realistically argue that increasing American energy independence will happen if we only stop drilling oil and gas, of which we are the world's largest producer, and become almost entirely beholden to China for our supply of solar panels and rare earth materials? Really, really dumb. Nuclear power, on the other hand, we could be uranium independent if we made a concerted effort to do it. The largest component in a nuclear power plant is concrete. I think we can find that around here. So nuclear power is the best from an energy security standpoint. We've already talked about why it's the best from a reliability standpoint. And yeah, it's the only thing that produces electricity around the clock, irrespective of the weather conditions, that is also carbon free. So it just doesn't make any sense for people to advocate for any other energy source if you actually think climate change is an existential crisis, right?
Yeah.
If that's the lens from which you view the world, and for you to not support nuclear power, totally unserious. I mean, that's next level gesture. gestureship right there.
It seems to me that that a lot of those things, you know, like wind and solar, they are dependent. They rely entirely on this thing of battery storage. Now that may happen, it might not. We just don't know. And if you're kind of, you know, going all in on something that may or may not happen, and taking on something off the table like nuclear, which you know you can do, I mean, that's just crazy. Most of the big inventions that have kind of, you know, revolutionized humanity, nobody sat down and planned them. Nobody sat down and said, right, okay, let's invent the internet, and it happened. It just kind of organically happened. I saw somebody the other day on Twitter, because there has been some discussion about how we increase energy supply to get us free from kind of Vladimir Putin. And someone said, what we need is a Manhattan Project for energy supply. No, we don't need that. You know, the Manhattan Project, you know, is one of those things, you know, where we sat down and said, right, we want to get to this end. You know, we're going to do this. And so we went and we sat and did that. It was based on an awful lot of existing work, of course. But we don't need to do that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. The things we have, the things we need are things we have. And so we just need to kind of exploit those, it seems to me.
And it's a terrible analogy anyway, right? Because the Manhattan Project was not trying to fundamentally transform the entire economy basically overnight, right? It's the same thing when we talk about a moonshot, right? Like the moonshot did not affect every aspect of our lives, right? And neither did the Manhattan Project. It was like, can we develop a nuclear weapon? Okay, let's pour a bunch of resources into that. Can we put a man on the moon? Now, how do we change everything? How do we change how people heat their homes, right? So natural gas, primary heating fuel in Minnesota, it would be a huge expenditure of capital to change all that over to electric infrastructure, whether you want to pretend heat pumps are going to get the job done and then have electric baseboard resistors. A lot of times you would still need a natural gas furnace in your house as a backup supply, right? So the people who want to reduce emissions the most are the least serious when it comes to acknowledging the cost of those, because they're so fixated on, you know, this kind of doomsday scenario that anything is worth it. And like we've seen with COVID, like people during the lockdowns, you know, you and I were just talking about this before the webinar. They said, if you don't agree with everything that we want to do to lock down the economy and slow the spread, you want to kill grandma. And if you so much as said, hey, you know, there will be consequences to this, like there will be costs to these, you know, policies as well as benefits, then you were just a pariah, right? So we kind of have that same exact conversation when it comes to energy. And unfortunately, you know, outlets like the Star Tribune don't do a good job of introducing a little bit more balance, because, you know, you can be on board. You don't even have to say anything about climate change to think that nuclear power is a really good idea, or that we need to consider whether these alternatives that are being offered are actually capable of doing the job. So let's get to Jenna Hellberg, who asked, there's been a lot of talk of a gas holiday. Will that really be a relief? Wouldn't a better long-term solution be found in giving out more permits for energy exploration or leases in the United States? So a gas holiday in Minnesota, the one that was proposed, would be about $73 over 3 months, because it was Labor Day to Memorial Day to Labor Day. So not a lot of relief there. I'd have to crunch the numbers to figure out what that would mean for Minnesota families if there was a holiday on the federal gas tax. But yeah, absolutely. The better solution is to just allow producers to produce more oil. That means, you know, infrastructure is great. More leases is fine. Most of our oil production happens on federal land. So the Biden administration doesn't have a lot of say in what happens there, but state regulatory agencies do. So Colorado sits on some of the large, or like some very large oil and natural gas deposits, but they passed legislation a few years ago that basically prohibits that from being tapped. So we're seeing policies, liberal policies. That's why we didn't say Biden's policies. You said liberal policies all over the country that are impeding the development of our energy resources. And it's actually, it's a lot better to just increase the supply rather than play games or do gimmicky stuff like get rid of the gas tax. So David Rolfe, why does China typically get a pass from the media, even the recent Scotland climate meeting when it comes to CO2 emissions? China has been the world's largest CO emitter for at least 10 years. That's a great question. And I don't know, John, do you have an idea why they get a pass? I think, you can make the argument that they're a developing country and they have the right to develop just as we have in the West. And that to me is a pretty persuasive argument. But the idea that if we outsource our jobs, if we make energy so expensive, or if we have bad tax policies that send our jobs and our factories over to China, that somehow absolves the emissions from being emitted. It's the same planet, right? So I think that is a huge mistake. The Walz administration is actually requiring projects that require an environmental impact statement to do a climate accounting of the project and potentially have to offset that. That's why we have that's why I have the cow in the background. You have a permit for that cow because some dairies were being harassed by environmental law firms, basically, who just exist to sue people and keep their name in the papers. But for the greenhouse gases that would be emitted from the cows as a result of expanding their dairy. So the problem is the planet doesn't care if the dairy expands in Wisconsin, Colorado, or Minnesota. So by sending emissions or sending that economic activity out of state, we've really done nothing for the planet, but only hurt ourselves from an economic standpoint. And unfortunately, that's all the Walz administration ever really wants to do on energy.
Yeah. And just a point about the gas tax. I mean, it's one of those taxes that it's not perfect, but it does come somewhat close to approximating a fee for a service rendered, use of the road. So, I mean, I'd be kind of loath to ditch it because the service is still going to be provided. The road's still going to be there. You're still going to be inflicting wear and tear on the road. And if you really are that concerned about the cost of living that Minnesotans face, give them a tax cut. They're some of the most heavily taxed citizens in the United States. So they could certainly use it. And just to come back around as well to one of the points about moonshots and Manhattan projects, it's the only rich countries can afford moonshots and Manhattan projects. Nobody before the Industrial Revolution or before in the pre-carbon days, thought about traveling to the moon. They were too busy trying to eat. Nobody thought about, a Manhattan project. You have to be rich to afford these things. And really what these things are, they kind of are an attack on the very sources of kind of economic prosperity that we've all come to take for granted. And I think that might be the biggest problem, that we've forgotten where a lot of this prosperity comes from.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to the end of this now. We've got about 5 minutes left. Do you have like a kind of final pitch? This is your, Peter Finch in Network moment. You get to kind of scream and just kind of let it all out. And what's your takeaway from this?
Yeah, I mean, the takeaway, I've said it like 4 times already, but we need secure supplies of reliable, affordable energy. And we want to make sure that we're doing that in the most environmentally way feasible for that time period, right? So I think it's a really bad idea to close down our coal plants right now because they've only got 20 years left on their useful lives, right? So in my opinion, we need to be very pragmatic and thoughtful about how we do this instead of listening to Greta Thunberg and thinking that the world is going to end in 10 years, because it's not going to. In all likelihood, I know it doesn't seem that way right now, given world events, but the world is going to be a better place 10 years from now than it was today, right? If you could get in a time machine and go back to any year, maybe you'd pick 2019 now, but otherwise you would pick today, right? When you think about the advances that we have in human standards of living, the bad old days of like pre-carbon were not good for human lives. We had huge infant mortality rates, short lifespans, short statures. We were actually shorter because we were malnourished. But it wasn't good for the environment either. John, your homeland was actually completely deforested at one point because people were using wood for their industrial processes, which pollutes more per unit of energy used. So when they discovered coal and started using that en masse, they actually were able to reforest Europe. I don't know if you knew that. I think I told you that one time. But the best way for us to move forward as a human species really is to make things more affordable, more efficient, more reliable, and more environmentally friendly over time. People don't like that kind of incrementalism, but that's really what is the tortoise won the race, not the hare.
Yeah, if you look back through history, there does seem to be some kind of human need, or not universally shared, but commonly shared, to believe that you're living in the end times.
Yep.
You'll find this. Religion was often the vehicle for such things. And it seems to me now, and this is a point I've made to you before, that an awful lot of modern environmentalism seems to me very similar to aspects of religion. And very often you have a kind of the same framework, just with different things draped over it. Instead of a vengeful Jehovah, we have, Gaia's going to boil us all in rising seas because we behave badly. We're all Sodom and Gomorrah now, apparently. And I think, so I think there's a need to believe in that, even though, as you say, living standards are higher now than they ever have been. And if you could pick any place at any time in human history to be alive, it would be here and now. That's not to say that things will always get better. The Dark Ages were a notable regress from the Roman Empire.
Right.
And I think if you were alive in 1900, looking at your children, if they were 2 and 3 years old, like mine are, you'd be thinking to yourself, kids have never had it so good. And of course, what do they have to look forward to? The First World War, Spanish influenza, depression, World War II. So, we can't take these things for granted. We have to fight for these things. We have to fight for progress. And so that, I think, is the message that I would like people to take away from this. I hope you would agree with that, Isaac. I think you would.
That's the whole mission of our organization, right? Like we
Yeah.
fight for these ideas because these are the ideas that have enriched humans, increased the standard of living, and made us a more free and, equal society. So on that note, if you've enjoyed this webinar, share it with your friends and family. Hop on AmericanExperiment.org's website and maybe consider donating to the cause in order to, keep producing quality content like this. And John, any last words on St. Patrick's Day? Give us some Gaelic.
Well, I would say, your lot are from the north, my lot are from the south.
So we're gonna fight later. Is basically get a few Guinnesses in us, and we're gonna rehash the old.
I got some in the car. But I would say, as my ancestors have said, Lor Phelan Podic Shona Dwit. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Thanks for tuning in. And I hope you've enjoyed it.